Hey everybody, happy Thursday. Hope everyone's week is going great. It's time for our weekly training chat. So if you missed last week's clip, we are in the month of February digging into training foundations. So just revisiting the basic fundamentals of different aspects of training, why we train the way we do, and different methodologies to go behind that and help you guys and gals have a better understanding of why we do what we do. So, without further ado, this week we are going to be chatting about heart rate training. So, if you're newer to triathlon or endurance sports, you may have heard about heart rate training but not quite know what it is and why we utilize it. So, really short definition of heart rate training is basically using either like a wrist-based device, or sometimes you also see a chest strap that will measure how many times your heart beats per minute. And hey, Stacy, thanks for hopping in. And so essentially, and you just intuitively probably know this as well, but at different exertion levels, different intensities, your heart will either beat faster or slower to help deliver oxygen and nutrients to all parts of your bodies to meet whatever demand you're placing on it. So that in a nutshell is heart rate. And heart rate training is essentially where we set different zones or different ranges of intensities. So for instance, it's usually depending on what methodologies you use, and there's so much information out there with some slightly differing theories about how to break this down. But typically you'll see, like 3, 5, 7 heart rate zones. Once you get beyond 7, it just kind of becomes a little bit overkill because you're still keeping, you're dealing with ranges. So to narrow it down so much becomes a little bit nitpicky in my opinion. So, hey, Dina. So typically, one of the most commonly utilized ones is by Joe Friel, and it's 7 zones. So zones 1 through 5, and then zone 5 has A, B, and C. So 5 being your highest, 1 being your lowest. And so essentially, there is a way to, and I'm going to talk about a few different methods, but essentially with kind of this 5 basic zone approach. Hey, Monica, thanks guys for hopping in. Essentially what you're looking at is aligning a certain number of beats per minute of your heart and basically gauging your intensity off your heart rate. So you can calculate this a few different ways. So some of the more common ones are, I think a lot of people are familiar with max heart rate, which standard would be take 220, subtract your age, and then you define and calculate your heart rate zones based on this kind of generic formula. Personally, I'm not a huge fan because this doesn't take into account individual variability. So typically what I have used in the past, among other methodologies, again, it's not a one size fits all, but something a bit more personalized that is easy to read up on and also to execute and figure out for yourself is what's called a lactate threshold heart rate, and then subsequently basing your heart rate zones off of this lactate threshold heart rate. And there's a 20-minute field test. I'm going to post a link here in the comments about how to go about setting your lactate threshold heart rate and calculating your training zones. And do know, and this is across the board, that your heart rate zones for running and for cycling are going to be different. Your heart rate zones for running are going to be higher. Your heart rate zones for cycling are going to be a little bit lower. General rule of thumb, again, this varies, but you'll probably see about 8 to 10 beats difference between running and cycling. Your zone ranges just across the board. So other types of heart rate modalities that you can look into. Some other, we've talked about max heart rate, we've talked about lactate threshold heart rate, which goes along with Joe Friel's recommendations. And then also a really common one with endurance sports that has gotten a lot of airtime recently is called the Maffetone method, developed by, I think his name is Phil Maffetone, which is pretty cut and dry. You stay below a certain heart rate threshold across nearly all of your training, and it's really intended to build your aerobic endurance base, which is awesome. So there's so much information out there that it's impossible to capture all of it in this short training talk, but I just want to really kind of throw some of these concepts out at y'all, and then I'll post some links in the comments that you can go and read up on the different methodologies and just be a student for just the sake of knowing what's out there, but also helping discern what works best for you and for your goals. All right, so that kind of clears up the what it is, the how, but I also want to talk for a couple minutes about when to use heart rate. So you've, again, got multiple schools of thought on this. Some people will use heart rate exclusively and live and die by what their heart rate monitor tells them. That's cool if it works for you. Personally, in my experience of going on nearly 2 decades of endurance training, I am somebody that often will forget to charge her watch. So taking things like this into account, that sometimes your charge will fail or equipment just sometimes doesn't function the way we hope it to. Having heart rate or other items like, and again, we're going to get into these in other training talks, but other effort-based measures like pace, power, these sorts of things, in addition to heart rate. These metrics are all good, but tuning into your perceived exertion and your perceived effort just on your own is really critical too. So to just base everything off of your watch, I think is a little bit short-sighted. It's so good and helpful to have, and it really kind of expands our awareness of what's going on internally, but also externally when we incorporate other measures of exertion and fatigue, etc., into assessing how we're doing, how our performance is doing, and how hard we're working. So I would say, certainly from my experience, I would highly recommend that if you look into heart rate based training and or other hard number metrics, also consider, and it also of course depends on the goals of your workout and your training, but also consider things like perceived effort and just tuning into how your body is feeling when you are utilizing these more hard metrics to really provide a well-rounded overview of how you're doing. So hopefully this is helpful. If you work with us, you'll certainly know that we encompass all of these different training methodologies, and heart rate is a wonderful tool, but it is not a be-all end-all, and it is not perfect. And then last final thought, if you are just getting into heart rate training, do know that your first test, and of course this is if you are doing the field tests, you do your initial test, and then occasionally you will need to retest, usually every couple of few months, just to make sure that everything is accurate. And also if you're utilizing your threshold pace along with this, you'll need to reassess a little bit more frequently just to make sure everything matches up. So happy training. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you out there. Stay badass.